The headline screamed across my phone screen at 5:47 a.m. Presidential affair exposed. Secret recordings reveal months-long relationship with White House intern. I set my coffee cup down with the same deliberate precision I'd practiced for 23 years of marriage. Outside our Georgetown townhouse, camera crews were already assembling like vultures sensing carrion. Inside, my husband slept soundly in our king-sized bed, blissfully unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to implode. What would you do if your husband's betrayal wasn't just personal, but a global spectacle? The tremor in my hands lasted exactly 12 seconds. I counted. Then I opened my laptop and began typing the first entry in what would become my war journal. Day 1, the dynasty dies. You see, most wives discover affairs through lipstick on collars or mysterious text messages. I discovered mine through a Washington Post exclusive that included audio recordings, hotel receipts, and security footage. 22-year-old Jessica from Iowa, blonde and bright-eyed. The kind of girl who probably grew up thinking Washington was where dreams came true. Poor thing had no idea she'd been sleeping with a monster. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 2 decades, I'd been the perfect political wife, smiling beside him at fundraisers, nodding thoughtfully during his speeches about family values, standing silently while he built his empire on the backs of broken promises and backroom deals. I'd buried my own law degree, my own ambitions, my own voice, all for the greater good of his political dynasty. And now, as I watched the news anchors dissect every salacious detail of his affair, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: clarity. The phone rang. His chief of staff, panicked and breathless, demanding to know where he was, what our response would be, how we planned to contain this disaster. I told him my husband was still sleeping and hung up. Let them scramble. Let them panic. Let them feel, for once, what it's like when the ground shifts beneath your feet without warning. I poured myself another cup of coffee and opened my secure laptop, the one he didn't know about, connected to accounts he couldn't access, containing files he'd never seen. While he'd been building his public empire, I'd been quietly constructing my own infrastructure. Not out of paranoia, but out of practicality. In Washington, survival isn't just about what you know, it's about what you've prepared for. The second headline appeared at 6:23 a.m. Rose Bonds, the woman behind the man. They were already crafting the narrative: the long-suffering wife, the victim of her husband's appetites, the collateral damage of political ambition. I laughed, actually laughed, because they had no idea what they were dealing with. I wasn't the woman behind the man. I was the architect of his destruction, and I'd been planning this renovation for longer than anyone knew. My phone buzzed with texts from friends, family, political allies, all offering sympathy, support, shoulders to cry on. I responded to each with the same measured grace I'd perfected over decades of political events. Grateful for their concern, focusing on family during this difficult time, appreciating their prayers and discretion. What I didn't tell them was that I'd been awake for months, not just since 5:47 a.m. I'd been sleepwalking through cocktail parties and campaign events, but my mind had been racing, calculating, preparing for exactly this moment. Because I'd known. Not about Jessica specifically, but about the inevitable. Men like my husband don't just stumble, they crater. And when they do, they take everyone down with them unless someone smarter has already built a lifeboat. I'd built more than a lifeboat. I'd built an ark. The irony was delicious. While the media painted me as the victim, I was actually the only one in this entire scandal who'd seen it coming. Not the affair, though I'd suspected, but the exposure, the fallout, the spectacular collapse that was about to consume everything he'd built. As I sat in our kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of a life I'd never really chosen, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: excitement. Not the cruel satisfaction of revenge, but the intellectual thrill of a chess match where I'd been thinking 15 moves ahead while my opponent had been focused on his next conquest. The clock struck 7 a.m. In 1 hour, he'd wake up to discover that his world had ended while he slept. But I wouldn't be there to comfort him or strategize damage control or play the role of the dutiful wife standing by her man. I had work to do. I opened the first of 17 files I'd been compiling over the past 3 years, not just on him, but on the entire corrupt ecosystem that had enabled his rise and protected his secrets. The boys' club that had closed ranks around powerful men while demanding silence from their wives. The donors who'd bought access and influence. The media figures who'd buried stories in exchange for exclusive access. They were all about to learn what happens when you underestimate a woman who's been watching, waiting, and preparing in the shadows. I saved my work, closed the laptop, and walked upstairs to shower. When I came back down, he'd be awake, panicked, expecting me to join his damage control efforts. Instead, he'd find a note on the kitchen counter. Gone to my sister's. Don't call. Don't follow. Don't assume I'll be standing beside you when you face the cameras today. What I didn't write was the rest of it, that while he scrambled to save his reputation, I'd be 3 steps ahead, dismantling not just his career but the entire corrupt system that had made his rise possible in the first place. The betrayal hadn't broken me. It had freed me. And now, finally, it was time to build something better from the ruins of his dynasty. Let me tell you about the woman I used to be, before I became the architect of Washington's most spectacular political collapse. 25 years ago, I was Rose Hamilton, fresh out of Georgetown law, clerking for a federal judge and dreaming of my own practice. I was brilliant, not in the way people say to be polite, but genuinely, measurably brilliant. Top 1% of my class, editor of the Law Review, offers from every major firm in the city. Then I met him at a fundraiser for environmental causes. Ironic, considering what we know now about his deals with oil companies. He was charismatic, ambitious, already being whispered about as a future presidential candidate. When he asked me to dinner, I said yes. When he asked me to marry him 8 months later, I said yes to that too. I said yes to a lot of things in those early years. Yes to moving to his hometown for his first congressional run. Yes to putting my career on hold while he built his. Yes to playing the perfect political wife. Beautiful but not threatening, intelligent but not challenging, supportive but never upstaging. I said yes to becoming a prop in someone else's story. The transformation was gradual, like drowning in slow motion. First, I took a leave of absence from the law firm to help with his campaign. Temporary, we said. Just until he got established. Then I got pregnant with our first child, and suddenly my career became secondary to raising the next generation of political dynasty. Don't misunderstand, I loved being a mother. But I hated the way my identity slowly dissolved into his ambitions. How conversations about my work dried up. How people stopped asking about my opinions and started asking about my husband's positions. How I went from being Rose Hamilton, attorney, to Rose Bonds, political wife. The sacrifices felt noble at the time. We were building something together, creating a legacy that would change the country. His success was our success. His dreams were our dreams. At least, that's what I told myself during the long nights when he was at the office, or traveling, or attending yet another fundraiser where my role was to smile and nod and make small talk about anything except the issues I actually cared about. But I wasn't naive. Even as I played my assigned role, I kept watching, learning, filing away information. Political wives see everything. We're present but invisible, trusted with secrets because we're assumed to be harmless. I learned about the donors who expected favors, the lobbyists who wrote legislation, the backroom deals that shaped policy. I learned about the other women too. Not affairs, not at first, but the pattern. The way he looked at young staffers. The way he lingered in conversations with attractive reporters. The way he found excuses to travel alone or stay late at the office. I wasn't paranoid, I was observant. And what I observed was a man who believed his own mythology, who thought his charm and power made him untouchable. The first real affair happened during his Senate race. I found hotel receipts, unexplained expenses, the usual signs. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it, he rationalized it. Stress of the campaign. Loneliness of travel. A moment of weakness that meant nothing. He promised it would never happen again. It happened again. Each time, the pattern was the same. Discovery. Confrontation. Apology. Promise. And each time, I made a choice. I could leave, scandal the family, destroy his career, start over at 40 with 2 children and a resume full of charity galas and campaign appearances. Or I could stay, protect the investment I'd already made, and find ways to insulate myself from his failures. I chose to stay. But I also chose to prepare. That's when I started what I privately called my insurance policy. Separate bank accounts he couldn't access. Legal documents protecting my interests. A network of contacts who owed loyalty to me, not him. I began keeping records, not just of his affairs, but of everything. His business dealings. His political compromises. His connections to the kinds of people who preferred shadows to spotlight. I told myself it was just practical. Protection against the day his recklessness caught up with him. I never planned to use the information offensively, just defensively, if circumstances required it. But circumstances have a way of evolving. The affairs became more frequent, more brazen. Young staffers who looked at me with pity at campaign events. Reporters who asked pointed questions about my husband's extracurricular activities. Donors who made crude jokes about his appetites, assuming I was too polite or too weak to object. I wasn't weak. I was strategic. While he built his public empire, congressional seat to Senate seat to presidential candidacy, I built my shadow operation. I cultivated relationships with journalists who were tired of access journalism and hungry for real stories. I connected with other political wives who'd grown sick of protecting powerful men's secrets. I found financial advisors who understood the importance of protecting assets from political volatility. Most importantly, I began documenting everything. Not just his affairs, those were almost mundane by then, but the corruption that enabled them. The donors who bought silence along with access. The staffers who procured hotel rooms and alibis. The party officials who buried stories and threatened whistleblowers. The entire ecosystem of complicity that protected powerful men while demanding sacrifice from their families. I started with simple notes. Dates, times, conversations overheard. Then I graduated to recording devices, legal in our jurisdiction, though he never bothered to check. I saved emails, photographed documents, maintained careful records of financial transactions that didn't quite add up. I wasn't planning a war. I was just documenting the battlefield. The Jessica affair was different, though. Not because it was more serious. By then, I'd stopped caring about his romantic entanglements, but because of how sloppy he'd become. Phone calls in the next room. Hotel reservations under his real name. Credit card receipts left on his desk like trophies. He'd grown so arrogant, so convinced of his own untouchability, that he'd stopped even pretending to be careful. That's when I knew the end was coming. Not because of moral failings or emotional betrayal, but because of simple mathematics. Arrogance plus recklessness equals exposure. And exposure, in Washington, equals destruction. The only question was whether I'd be destroyed with him. I'd spent 20 years building shields, creating separation, preparing for exactly this scenario. Financial independence. Legal protection. Political allies who owed loyalty to me personally, not to his administration. A carefully constructed public image as the intelligent, gracious wife who'd sacrificed her own ambitions for his success. But most importantly, I'd built something else, a complete record of the corruption that had enabled his rise. When the story broke that morning, I wasn't devastated. I was vindicated. Everything I'd predicted, prepared for, and protected against was finally happening. The betrayal hadn't broken my heart, it had freed my ambition. Hit like if you've ever been underestimated while planning your smartest move. Because what the media, his staff, and he himself didn't understand was that I wasn't just surviving this scandal. I was orchestrating its aftermath. The woman who'd spent 2 decades saying yes was finally ready to start saying no. And the system that had protected him while demanding my silence was about to discover what happens when the smartest person in the room has been planning her move for 20 years. The beautiful thing about watching an empire collapse is how predictable the sequence becomes once you understand the architecture. By 8 a.m. on day 1, his chief of staff had called 17 times. By 9 a.m., the party leadership was demanding an emergency meeting. By 10 a.m., late-night comedy shows were already crafting monologues about the president's intern problem. I watched it all unfold from my sister's house in Virginia, safe behind carefully constructed firewalls I'd spent years building. The first phase was pure chaos. His team had no playbook for this level of exposure because they'd grown complacent, convinced that their usual methods of damage control, aggressive denials, character assassination of accusers, strategic counter-leaks, would work like they always had. But this wasn't a whisper campaign or a single anonymous source. This was audio recordings, financial records, security footage, and a paper trail that led directly back to official government resources being used for personal indulgences. His press secretary looked like she was facing a firing squad during the noon briefing. The poor woman had been kept completely in the dark, left to discover the scandal alongside the rest of America. She fumbled through non-answers and deflections while reporters shouted increasingly specific questions about hotel reservations, Secret Service details, and taxpayer-funded travel being used for romantic getaways. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. By afternoon, the party leadership was in full crisis mode. Emergency meetings, urgent conference calls, heated discussions about the path forward. I knew this because I still had friends in those rooms, women who'd watched their own husbands navigate scandals, who understood the difference between loyalty to a person and loyalty to principles. They called to check on me, offering support and sharing intelligence. The party was fracturing. Some wanted to stand by him, others wanted him to resign immediately. The split wasn't ideological, it was practical. Those who'd been complicit in covering up his past behavior were doubling down, while those who'd been kept in the dark were furious about being blindsided. What none of them knew was that I'd been feeding information to key reporters for months, not about the affairs specifically, but about the broader pattern of corruption that made them possible. The Jessica story was just the tip of the iceberg, and I was the one who'd been mapping the entire frozen mass beneath the surface. The second phase began that evening with his first public statement. Rather than the contrite apology his team had undoubtedly prepared, he went off script. Blamed the media for invasion of privacy. Questioned the timing of the story. Suggested political motivations behind the leak. I laughed out loud watching it. He was following his instincts, attack, deflect, never admit weakness, without understanding that those instincts had been calibrated for a different kind of scandal. This wasn't about policy disagreements or political gamesmanship. This was about personal conduct so egregious that even his allies were scrambling for distance. Meanwhile, I was already 3 moves ahead. That evening, I met with my attorney, not the family lawyer who'd handled our personal affairs, but a specialist I'd retained privately 3 years earlier. We reviewed the financial protections I'd put in place, separate accounts, property holdings in my name only, investment portfolios he couldn't access. More importantly, we discussed the legal implications of what was coming. Because while everyone else was focused on the affair, I knew the real story was the corruption investigation that would inevitably follow. Federal resources misused for personal purposes. Campaign funds possibly diverted for hush money. Official government time spent on personal business. The Jessica affair was a scandal. The cover-up was going to be criminal. I'd spent years documenting not just his behavior, but the institutional machinery that enabled it. Staff members who made hotel reservations and airline bookings for non-official travel. Security details reassigned for personal protection during romantic getaways. Government communications used to coordinate meetings and alibis. Every transaction. Every compromised official. Every instance where public resources were used for private purposes. While his team focused on damage control, I was preparing to be a witness, not a victim. The third phase was the most satisfying, watching his arrogance collide with reality. By day 3, major donors were demanding meetings. Corporate sponsors were quietly distancing themselves from events he was scheduled to attend. Foreign leaders were postponing diplomatic visits, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood were actually political calculations about association with damaged goods. His response was to double down. Private meetings with loyalists where he dismissed the scandal as a temporary distraction. Angry calls with donors demanding they honor their commitments. Increasingly erratic behavior that suggested he genuinely believed he could weather this like he'd weathered everything else. He called me on day 4. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message with the same detachment I'd cultivated over years of political disappointments. He needed me to make a statement of support. The party leadership was pressuring him to have his family appear united. His polling numbers were in free fall, and his advisors thought a joint appearance would help stabilize the situation. He actually sounded surprised that I hadn't immediately rushed to his side. I called him back that evening, when I knew he'd be in meetings and would have to step away to take the call privately. "I won't be making any public statements," I told him. "Rose, this is not the time for." "This is exactly the time. I've spent 23 years making statements I didn't believe to support positions I didn't hold. I'm done." "You don't understand the implications." "I understand them perfectly. Better than you do, apparently." The silence stretched between us, and I could almost hear him recalculating. He was used to managing me through combination of charm and expectation, but both of those tools had lost their effectiveness the moment I decided I had nothing left to lose. "What do you want?" he finally asked. It was the right question. "Finally. I want you to understand that I'm not your political wife anymore. I'm not your victim. I'm not your ally. I'm an independent operator with my own interests and my own agenda." "Which is what, exactly?" "Truth," I said. "Complete, unvarnished truth about how power actually works in this city. Starting with your administration and expanding from there." "Rose. 23 years I spent protecting your secrets. Now I'm going to spend whatever time I have left exposing them." I hung up before he could respond. Subscribe if you love seeing arrogance unravel piece by piece. Because what he still didn't understand, what his entire team failed to grasp, was that I wasn't reacting to the scandal. I was orchestrating the next phase of it. While he scrambled to contain damage to his reputation, I was preparing to expand the scope of inquiry beyond his personal conduct to the systemic corruption that made it possible. The affair was embarrassing. The cover-up was criminal. But the broader pattern of abuse of power I was about to expose would end more than just his presidency. It would dismantle the entire dynasty he'd built, and the network of complicity that supported it. Phase 4 was about to begin, and for the first time in decades, I was the one setting the agenda. The transformation from political wife to independent operator required recalibrating every relationship I'd built over 2 decades. But what I discovered was that Washington runs on favors, information, and access, and I'd been accumulating all three while everyone assumed I was just smiling and nodding. My first strategic move was the interview request from CNN. Not the fluff piece his team expected, where the loyal wife expresses disappointment but commits to working through their problems. Not the victim narrative where I tearfully describe betrayal and heartbreak. Instead, I called the producer directly and proposed something different. A serious policy discussion about government accountability and institutional reform. "Mrs. Bonds," she said carefully, "given the current situation, wouldn't it be more appropriate to address the personal aspects of—" "The personal aspects are irrelevant," I interrupted. "What matters is how personal conduct reflects institutional failures. I'd like to discuss systematic reforms that would prevent future abuse of office." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she was still on the line. "That's not what anyone expects you to say." "Exactly." The interview aired on a Thursday evening. While the host clearly expected me to break down discussing my husband's betrayal, I instead presented a detailed analysis of how government resources had been systematically misused, how oversight mechanisms had failed, and how institutional culture prioritized protecting powerful men over accountability to taxpayers. I didn't mention Jessica once. I didn't express personal hurt or anger. Instead, I calmly discussed financial irregularities, security protocol violations, and the broader pattern of ethical lapses that the affair represented. "You're describing criminal behavior," the host said, clearly surprised by the direction of our conversation. "I'm describing standard operating procedure that happens to be criminal," I corrected. "The difference is that now we have documentation." The response was immediate and electric. Social media exploded with clips of me discussing policy rather than personal trauma. Editorial boards praised the interview as a masterclass in reframing scandal as systematic failure. Most importantly, other women, congressional wives, cabinet spouses, political operatives who'd been marginalized and silenced, began reaching out privately. They had stories. They had documentation. They had years of suppressed anger about being expected to enable corruption while maintaining their silence. I'd accidentally created a network. My second move was the book deal. Publishers had been circling since the scandal broke, offering ghostwritten tell-alls about life with a powerful man. I turned them all down except one, the university press that promised complete editorial control and a serious examination of institutional reform rather than personal memoir. The book would be called Systematic Failures: How Washington's Culture of Complicity Enables Abuse of Power. Not catchy, but accurate. More importantly, it would be meticulously documented, legally vetted, and impossible to dismiss as personal vendetta. While I wrote, information kept flowing from sources I'd cultivated over decades. Congressional staffers who'd grown tired of covering for their bosses. Journalists who'd been pressured to kill stories. Government employees who'd witnessed illegal use of resources but lacked platforms to report it. Everything led back to the same institutional problems. No real oversight, no meaningful consequences, and a culture that prioritized political survival over ethical governance. The Jessica affair was just the most recent example. My third move was strategic philanthropy. I'd been quietly building a private foundation for years, funded through careful investment of money I'd earned from speaking fees and board positions. Income streams he'd encouraged because they enhanced our family's prestige without threatening his political position. What he didn't know was that I'd been using those positions to build relationships with reform-minded donors, investigative journalists, and accountability organizations. People who were tired of Washington's corruption but lacked coordinated strategy for addressing it. The foundation would fund investigative journalism, government transparency initiatives, and legal challenges to institutional failures. But more importantly, it would serve as coordination hub for the growing network of women who were ready to stop protecting powerful men's secrets. We called ourselves the Accountability Project. By month 2 of the scandal, we'd documented systematic abuses across multiple agencies and administrations. Not just affairs, though there were plenty of those, but financial irregularities, security violations, abuse of government resources, and cover-ups that implicated dozens of high-ranking officials. The beauty of the operation was its legitimacy. Everything we did was legal, transparent, and focused on institutional reform rather than personal destruction. We weren't seeking revenge. We were demanding accountability, which made us infinitely more dangerous than traditional opposition research. The fourth phase began when other women started going public. Not about affairs, those were still legally and politically complicated, but about the culture of complicity they'd been expected to maintain. Congressional wives who'd been pressured to make excuses for their husband's behavior. Female staffers who'd been marginalized after refusing to participate in cover-ups. Journalists who'd been blacklisted for asking uncomfortable questions. Each story individually was manageable. But collectively, they painted a picture of systematic dysfunction that transcended party lines and individual scandals. The media began calling it the Bonds effect, women who'd been silenced for decades suddenly finding their voices and platforms. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't inspiring these women to speak out. I was providing them with infrastructure to speak effectively. Legal support, media training, financial resources, strategic coordination. We weren't just breaking silence anymore. We were waging systematic warfare against institutional corruption. My husband's response was predictable and catastrophic. Instead of accepting responsibility and implementing reforms, he tried to discredit the entire movement as politically motivated. He held press conferences attacking disgruntled spouses and bitter former employees who were trying to destroy him out of personal spite. He actually used the phrase witch hunt in a speech about government accountability. The optics were devastating. Here was a man who'd been caught using taxpayer resources for personal affairs, attacking women who demanded systematic reforms to prevent future abuse. Every statement he made reinforced the narrative we'd been building, that institutional corruption wasn't individual failing but cultural norm that powerful men felt entitled to maintain. More women came forward. More documentation surfaced. More connections emerged between seemingly isolated incidents of abuse and cover-up. By month 3, congressional hearings were inevitable. Not just about his conduct, but about the systematic failures that enabled it. The Accountability Project had assembled such comprehensive documentation that ignoring institutional reform was no longer politically viable for either party. Both Democrats and Republicans were discovering that their own members had been compromised by the same culture of complicity we'd been exposing. Comment below, would you call this survival, justice, or cold revenge? The question missed the point entirely. This wasn't about personal feelings, it was about power structures. For 23 years, I'd watched how power actually functioned in Washington. Not the civics textbook version about checks and balances, but the real version about favors and cover-ups and institutional protection for connected men. I'd been forced to participate in that system, enabling corruption through my silence and complicity. Now I was systematically dismantling it, using the same tools and relationships and access that had been used to maintain it. The betrayal hadn't wounded me. It had educated me about the difference between working within corrupt systems and working to replace them. And replacement, it turned out, was much more satisfying than accommodation. By month 4, we weren't just documenting abuse anymore. We were drafting legislation, supporting accountability-focused candidates, and building permanent infrastructure to prevent future institutional capture. The Accountability Project had evolved from crisis response to systematic reform movement. And my husband? He was still focused on managing his personal reputation while the entire system that had enabled his rise crumbled around him. Phase 5 would be the most satisfying of all, watching him try to rebuild his dynasty with tools that no longer existed. Because we hadn't just exposed his corruption. We'd eliminated the conditions that made it possible in the first place. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. My husband's voice was different. Not the confident baritone that had charmed donors and intimidated opponents for decades, but something smaller, more desperate. Rose, I need you. I'd been expecting this moment for months, ever since the Accountability Project's documentation had triggered congressional hearings, federal investigations, and the kind of comprehensive institutional scrutiny that powerful men spend their careers avoiding. No, I said simply. You don't. Listen to me. I've been listening to you for 23 years. I'm done. But he kept talking, and despite everything, I found myself curious about his strategy. Because surely he had one. Men like him always had plans, angles, ways to manipulate circumstances to their advantage. He was launching what he called a redemption tour. Television specials about learning from mistakes. A book about the dangers of power corrupting good intentions. Speaking engagements at churches and community centers where he discussed the importance of forgiveness and second chances. The American people are generous, he said. They believe in redemption stories. Nixon came back. Clinton survived impeachment. This is just another chapter. I almost laughed. Almost. You're comparing yourself to presidents who faced political scandals. You're facing criminal investigations. The Justice Department won't prosecute a sitting president. You're not going to be sitting much longer. The silence stretched between us, and I could hear him recalculating again. This was the conversation I'd been waiting for, the moment when his arrogance finally collided with mathematics. What do you want? He asked again, like he'd asked months ago. But this time, the question was different. This time, it came from desperation rather than negotiation. I want you to understand that your redemption tour won't work, I said. Not because Americans don't believe in second chances, but because I have documentation of first chances, second chances, third chances, and dozens of chances after that. This isn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This is a pattern of behavior spanning decades. Rose. I have recordings, financial documents, testimony from witnesses, evidence of systematic corruption that goes far beyond personal conduct. Your redemption narrative requires the fiction that this was an isolated incident. I can prove it wasn't. You're threatening me. I'm educating you about reality. The beautiful thing about that conversation was how clearly it revealed the fundamental difference between us. He still believed that charisma and narrative control could overcome documented evidence. That charm could trump accountability. That the same techniques that had built his political career could rebuild it after complete exposure. I understood that those techniques only worked in systems designed to protect powerful men from consequences. We'd systematically dismantled those systems. His first television special aired 2 weeks later. The production values were impressive: soft lighting, comfortable setting, sympathetic interviewer who asked predetermined questions designed to elicit contrition and hope. He performed beautifully, acknowledged mistakes without admitting crimes, discussed the pressures of public service and the temptations of power, talked about his love for family and country, his commitment to earning back public trust, his determination to use this experience to become a better leader. It was a masterclass in political theater. It was also completely ineffective. Not because the American people are particularly unforgiving, but because the Accountability Project had spent months reframing the conversation. This wasn't about personal redemption. It was about institutional reform. His individual character was less important than the systematic changes needed to prevent future abuse of power. More importantly, we'd timed the release of new documentation to coincide with his media appearances. While he spoke about learning from his mistakes, we were publishing evidence of his attempts to cover them up. While he discussed earning forgiveness, we were revealing the extent of his corruption. Every redemption narrative was immediately contradicted by fresh revelations. The second phase of his comeback attempt was more aggressive. Rather than accepting responsibility, he began attacking the institutions investigating him, claiming political bias in the Justice Department, suggesting that congressional hearings were partisan theater, arguing that the media was coordinating with his political enemies to destroy him. This was a more familiar strategy, one that had worked for him in previous scandals. Attack the messenger, question the process, rally supporters around the idea that he was being unfairly targeted by establishment forces. But this strategy also relied on systems and relationships that no longer existed. The media figures he'd once been able to influence through access and exclusivity were now competing to break new stories about institutional corruption. The congressional allies who'd once provided protective cover were facing their own accountability problems. The donors who'd once funded his defense were discovering that association with his administration had become toxic to their other political investments. Most importantly, the network of complicity that had once enabled cover-ups was now actively participating in exposure. Women who'd spent careers maintaining silence about powerful men's behavior were providing testimony, documentation, and strategic intelligence to investigators. Former staffers were cooperating with federal prosecutors. Government employees were reporting ethics violations they'd previously been pressured to ignore. His attacks on institutions weren't just ineffective, they were accelerating the exposure process by demonstrating the exact kind of authoritarian contempt for accountability that reformers had been warning about. Phase 3 of his attempted comeback was the most desperate: direct appeals to his political base. Rally-style events where he positioned himself as victim of corrupt establishment forces. Social media campaigns claiming that attacks on him were really attacks on his supporters' values. Fundraising appeals that framed donations as resistance to political persecution. This strategy had worked brilliantly in previous contexts, allowing him to maintain support even during significant scandals. His base had always been willing to interpret criticism of him as elite disdain for their beliefs and priorities. But this time was different, for reasons he couldn't quite understand. The Accountability Project hadn't framed our work as partisan opposition. We'd positioned it as institutional reform that transcended party lines. Our documentation included Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and progressives, anyone who'd participated in corrupt systems regardless of ideology. More importantly, we'd focused on financial accountability, taxpayer money used for personal purposes, government resources diverted for private benefit, public trust betrayed for individual gain. These weren't partisan issues. They were fundamental questions about whether public officials served themselves or their constituents. When his supporters discovered that their tax dollars had funded hotel rooms for his affairs, security details for his romantic getaways, and government staff time spent coordinating his personal activities, partisan loyalty became harder to maintain. The final phase was the most satisfying to watch: complete institutional abandonment. Party leadership stopped taking his calls. Major donors redirected their support to other candidates. Media allies began distancing themselves from his administration. Foreign governments postponed diplomatic initiatives indefinitely. Even his own staff began quietly seeking other employment. The ecosystem that had sustained his career, the intricate web of mutual benefit, shared secrets, and protective silence, simply evaporated. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet calculation. Everyone who'd once found it profitable to enable his behavior discovered that association had become liability. His final television appearance was scheduled for a Sunday morning political show. The kind of platform that had once provided friendly territory for damage control and narrative management. Instead, he faced 45 minutes of detailed questions about financial irregularities, criminal investigations, and systematic abuse of office. I watched from my new office in downtown Washington, headquarters for the Accountability Project, which had grown from crisis response into permanent institutional reform organization. Surrounding me were files documenting corruption across multiple agencies, draft legislation for systematic oversight improvements, and strategic plans for supporting accountability-focused candidates in upcoming elections. On screen, my husband looked older, smaller, diminished in ways that went beyond simple political setback. He'd built his identity around being the smartest person in every room, the master manipulator who could charm or intimidate his way through any crisis. But charm and intimidation only work when other people need something from you. When you become liability rather than asset, those tools lose their effectiveness entirely. Mr. President, the host was saying, you've repeatedly claimed that these investigations are politically motivated. But the evidence comes from your own administration's records. Are you suggesting that your own staff fabricated documentation of financial irregularities? He fumbled through an answer about disgruntled employees and partisan prosecutors, but the words had lost their power. Not because they weren't skillfully delivered, he was still a talented politician, but because the audience had evolved beyond susceptibility to those particular manipulations. When people understand how institutional corruption actually works, claims of political persecution sound less like legitimate defense and more like additional evidence of the problem. The interview concluded with him promising to continue fighting for the American people despite unprecedented attacks by establishment forces. Standard language that had once rallied supporters and intimidated opponents. Now it just sounded hollow. That evening, I received a call from the network producer who'd conducted the interview. Mrs. Bonds, would you be interested in providing analysis of the president's statements? 6 months ago, that question would have been absurd. Political wives didn't publicly contradict their husbands. They certainly didn't provide media commentary on their spouse's legal and ethical problems. But I was no longer a political wife. I was an independent operator with expertise in institutional corruption and systematic reform. I'd be happy to discuss the institutional failures that made his behavior possible, I said. And the personal aspects. The betrayal, the family impact. Irrelevant. What matters is preventing future abuse of office through systematic oversight and accountability mechanisms. The interview aired the following evening, positioned as counterpoint to his morning appearance. While he'd focused on personal vindication and political persecution, I discussed policy solutions and institutional reform. The contrast was stark. He looked backward, toward grievances and justifications. I looked forward, toward systematic improvements and preventive measures. More importantly, I looked competent, knowledgeable, prepared. Everything that effective leadership required and that he demonstrated he no longer possessed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Interview requests from major networks. Speaking invitations from policy organizations. Inquiries about political ambitions and future plans. For the first time in decades, people were asking about my opinions rather than his positions. My expertise rather than his agenda. My vision for the future rather than his version of the past. If this ending gave you chills, hit that like button. Because what I'd accomplished wasn't just personal vindication or political revenge. I'd demonstrated something much more important. That institutional corruption could be systematically dismantled by people who understood how those institutions actually functioned. The Accountability Project had grown into national reform movement with chapters in 30 states, dedicated funding streams, and legislative agenda focused on transparency, oversight, and consequences for abuse of power. WID supported successful candidates who committed to institutional reform. WID passed ballot initiatives requiring financial disclosure and ethics oversight. WID created permanent infrastructure for preventing future capture of democratic institutions by corrupt actors. Most importantly, WID changed the cultural narrative around accountability. Demanding consequences for powerful people was no longer seen as partisan attack or personal vendetta, but as basic requirement for democratic governance. My husband's dynasty hadn't just collapsed, it had been replaced by something better. 6 months later, he called again. Not the desperate midnight plea this time, but something that sounded almost like curiosity. "I've been watching your interviews," he said. "Reading about your foundation work. And you're good at this. Really good. I never realized. You never realized I was capable of independent thought. I never realized you were capable of this. Building something. Leading something. Being someone other than your wife." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he was considering the implications of that sentence. 23 years of marriage where my identity had been completely subsumed by his ambitions. Where my intelligence had been channeled into supporting his career rather than building my own. Where my capabilities had been invisible because he'd never needed to see them. "I underestimated you," he finally said. "Yes, you did. Everyone did. Yes, they did." Another pause, and then, "What happens now?" It was a good question. The criminal investigations would continue through their processes. The congressional hearings would produce their reports and recommendations. The institutional reforms we'd initiated would evolve through legislative and electoral systems. But for me personally, for the first time in decades, I had choices that weren't constrained by someone else's political calculations. "Now I build the future I want to live in," I said. Without asking permission from anyone. Tell me in the comments, what's the smartest way you've ever flipped betrayal into power? Because that's what this story was really about. Not revenge against unfaithful husband or vindication after personal betrayal, but systematic transformation of corrupt institutions by someone who'd been forced to understand exactly how they operated. I'd spent 23 years as political wife, watching powerful men enable each other's worst behavior while demanding silence from women who witnessed it. I'd been complicit in systems I despised because individual resistance seemed futile and collective action seemed impossible. But betrayal had freed me from obligations I'd never actually chosen. Scandal had provided platform I'd never been offered. Crisis had created opportunity I'd never been allowed to pursue. The woman who'd once said yes to everything had learned the power of strategic no. The wife who'd once enabled corruption had become the architect of accountability. The silent partner in someone else's dynasty had built her own empire from the ruins of his arrogance. And subscribe for more stories where intelligence crushes arrogance. Because in the end, that's what this was, intelligence crushing arrogance. Preparation overwhelming improvisation. Strategic thinking defeating tactical manipulation. For 2 decades, I'd been underestimated by everyone who mattered. My husband, his staff, party leadership, media figures, donors, and political operatives. They'd seen me as accessory to someone else's ambition rather than independent actor with my own capabilities and agenda. Their underestimation had been my greatest strategic advantage. While they focused on managing short-term political crises, I'd been building long-term institutional solutions. While they relied on personal relationships and individual loyalty, I'd been creating systematic accountability mechanisms. While they tried to preserve corrupt systems that benefited them personally, I'd been designing transparent alternatives that served public interest. The betrayal hadn't broken me. It had revealed me. And what it revealed was someone who'd been planning for this moment much longer than anyone realized. The dynasty was dead. The empire I'd built from its ashes was just beginning. Rose Bonds was no longer anyone's wife, anyone's accessory, anyone's silent partner. I was the future of American politics, And I'd earned it through 23 years of careful preparation disguised as dutiful service. The smartest revenge, it turned out, wasn't personal at all. It was institutional. And it was permanent.